Introduction and very happy and healthy good evening dear my friends and professional colleagues. Indeed it's a pleasure moment to be with you this evening, being a speaker in this webinar speaker program regarding the master class in insulins. So just let me begin my topic. The today's topic being the therapeutic inertia in type 2 diabetes mellitus management and towards timely insulin initiation. So first of all, let me just define what is therapeutic inertia in type 2 diabetes mellitus. So therapeutic inertia is defined as the failure of the healthcare professional or the healthcare provider to initiate or intensify the therapy when the therapeutic goals are not reached. This is the definition of therapeutic inertia. So with that, we just get into the session. So this is my financial disclosure. As a speaker, I have been commercially supported by Novo Nordisk for this promotional meeting in return for providing a service, and has no actual or potential conflict of interest in relation to this presentation. And today's agenda is divided into three parts. The part 1 being the natural history of type 2 diabetes mellitus progression, and type 2 being the good glycemic control and implications on a short term and long term basis, and the last being the timely usage of the insulin, an Indian patient centric approach. And now we begin the part 1 with a case study. The patient who is on multiple OADs, still his diabetes is not yet controlled. It's a case of T2DM and multiple OADs, and the patient is not yet to the target. It's uncontrolled type 2 diabetes on multiple OADs. So if we come to the history, the relevant history would be it's Mrs. Nirmala, aged around 52-year-old, and has a history of diabetes mellitus for the last 8 years. And her HbA1c, the glycosylated hemoglobin, is 8.5%. That is definitely above from the normalcy. That is 1.5% at least above the normal recommended goal of HbA1c according to the American Diabetes Association standards of medical care in diabetes. That is 7 or less than 7 is the target goal, whereas this patient has got 8.5%. And coming to the medication, the current medication what Mrs. Nirmala is taking is, she is on oral tablets of metformin 500 mg twice a day, that is 1 in the morning, 1 in the night, and a tablet Acarbose 50 milligram 1 in the morning, 1 in the night, and tablet glipizide 10 milligram, that is 1 in the morning and 1 in the night. So she is on totally 1 gram of metformin divided in 2 doses. She is on 100 milligram of Acarbose, alpha glucosidase inhibitor, 50 gram BD, and she is on a sulfonylurea secretagogue, that is a glipizide 20 milligram, that is 10 milligram BID. And coming to the lifestyle of Mrs. Nirmala, she runs a busy shop. She is studied until high school, and she falls under the category of low income group. So her socio-economic status is like low income group. So now coming to the development of the type 2 diabetes mellitus. You remember one thing, it is always progressive. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is always progressive in nature, and all the time we just have to remember the gold standard slide that is been depicted by Dr. Ralph A. DiFranco, who is considered to be the father of the modern diabetes, modern diabetology, who has depicted the natural course of diabetes in such a way that it starts with NGT, that is normal glucose tolerance, that is less than 100 milligram fasting, and a post lunch, that is less than 140 milligram per deciliter is considered to be normal, that is called NGT. From there it starts with IFG, that is impaired fasting glucose, that is from 100 milligram to 125 milligram of deciliter is defined as impaired fasting glucose, and then it progresses on to IGT, that is the impaired glucose tolerance, that is from 140 to 199 milligram per deciliter. And you can only define IGT, you can only coin the term IGT when the patient is done with the blood glucose 2 hours after the 75 grams of glucose. That is only defined as IGT, that is impaired glucose tolerance must be measured only with 75 grams of glucose, and 2 hours post glucose, if it falls in the category of 140 to 199, it is called the IGT. And put together these two are called the IGT and IFG. Either of them or put together both, they are categorized as prediabetes, and eventually within 4 to 7 years of the prediabetes, the patient progresses on to the type 2 diabetes mellitus, that is called overt type 2 diabetes mellitus. So you can see in this diagram, on the top you find the insulin resistance, on the below you find the progressive beta cell failure. These are the etiological features of type 2 diabetes. The one being the insulin resistance, and the second being the progressive beta cell failure. And the beta cells increase the insulin output to maintain a normal glucose tolerance, and they decline in the insulin secretion, which is a vicious cycle, and it leads to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance per se leads to decline in the insulin secretion, that leads to progressive beta cell failure, and that again leads to insulin resistance, and again beta cell increases insulin output to maintain a normal glucose tolerance. A normal regulation of glucose metabolism is determined by a feedback loop involving the islet cells of the beta cells and the insulin sensitive tissues. And put together this insulin resistance and the progressive beta cell failure, they lead to the rise in the postprandial plasma blood glucose levels. That starts in the beginning. To start with, the postprandial blood sugars, they start rising, and followed by the rise in the fasting plasma glucose, which in turn leads to the overt type 2 diabetes. So the basic defects in this the postprandial plasma glucose elevation is because of the two mechanisms. It is the loss of the first phase of insulin response. There are two phases in the insulin response. One is the acute phase, which is called the first phase. Second is the delayed phase, which is called the second phase. See, the defect lies in both the steps. That is, in the acute stage, that is loss of first phase of insulin response is blunted, so the blood sugars, they tend to rise. And second thing is, even the second phase of insulin response gets blunted or delayed, which in turn leads to overt diabetes. And progressive beta cell failure determines the rate of disease progression. And now we see the insulin physiology. The secretory defect in T2DM, the earliest defect in T2DM is loss of first phase of insulin secretion. That's what I told you. It is otherwise known as FIPR, that is loss of first phase of insulin response, we call it as. And now it is the loss of first phase of acute insulin secretion. That is, you find in this the two graphs, you can see one is normal and the second is type 2 diabetes. You can clearly see in the normal, the first phase is the acute secretion and the second phase is the delayed secretion, or the second phase we call it as like a delayed secretion of insulin response. If it is perfectly working, naturally the insulin secretion comes out of the beta cells of the pancreas, and they control the blood sugar levels, and they take the blood glucose levels to the normalcy. It's somewhere around some 60 to 90 to 120. You can see this. So whereas in type 2 diabetes, because of the blunting of the insulin response, the secretory defects in the insulin secretory defects, which lead to the blunting of the or loss of the first phase of insulin secretion, and the delayed or the blunted second phase of insulin response is blunted. So we find all the time a uptrend. You find a downtrend in the normal, you find an uptrend in the blood glucose in the type 2 diabetes. So insulin secretory defects in T2DM can be mitigated with exogenous insulin therapy. That is, exogenous insulin is nothing but the insulin taken from the outside. And this is a busy slide actually, and this is very important also. The progression of type 2 diabetes mellitus and the long-term complications. Now you can see from the top, we just come from the top, and on top of it, it's written that the progression of type 2 diabetes mellitus. That's what I told you. The progression of type 2 diabetes mellitus starts from normal glucose tolerance, that is NGT, from IFG, that is impaired fasting glucose, and it progresses on to the IGT, that is impaired glucose tolerance. Either of these are put together will lead to the overt diabetes, that is the progression to overt type 2 diabetes mellitus. And you find 7 types of graphs here you can find. The first being the gray, that indicates insulin resistance. See, the insulin resistance slowly starts taking an upward trend, and it slowly progresses. Insulin resistance is nothing but it's a sort of insulin corruption. Insulin, there is so-called the insulin which is secreted by the beta cell. Though the pancreatic beta cells, they produce the sufficient quantities of insulin, just because of the insulin resistance at the level of muscle, at the level of liver, at the level of fat tissue, it is not being utilized by the body properly. So there is the rise in the blood sugars we find, that is called insulin resistance, otherwise known as like insulin corruption. What all we need is, we need to decrease the insulin resistance and increase the insulin sensitivity to counter this insulin resistance. And the second is the dark, what you call dark brown is the hepatic glucose production. See this curve, second curve, it also takes a slow and until this impaired IGT phase, it remains very parallel, and when it progresses on to type 2 diabetes, it takes an upward trend, upward curve. And third is the insulin level, that is the light yellow, dark yellow, not light yellow. The dark yellow is the insulin level. You can see the progressive decline. From here it goes on, like it takes a downtrend curve. The insulin level goes on reducing day by day, month by month, year by year, and later on the progression of type 2 diabetes mellitus naturally occurs. And the fourth one being the light yellow, that is the incretin effect. You can see they go very parallel, like okay, again you find this particular incretin, this thing also that slowly goes down along with the insulin. And the green one is the beta cell function. See, both the incretin effect and the beta cell function, they go parallelly, like they take a downward curve, and they just get into this decline in the beta cell function, and it's a progressive one. Beta cell function is always very progressive in type 2 diabetes, and it's 100% relentless, 100% death is type 1 diabetes. And coming to the sixth one, that is the blue one, is postprandial glucose. See, in the IGT, it takes a flat curve and slowly it starts moving on, and when the over diabetes, the postprandial glucose starts raising. So, and last is the fasting plasma glucose, which is in the brick red color. You can see that remains almost normal during the IGT phase or the pre-diabetic phase. What we call, I said, it takes around 4 to 7 years from the pre-diabetes to progress onto the type 2 diabetes. All these take an upward trend, the postprandial glucose followed by the fasting plasma glucose. And the importance of diagnosing the diabetes or even diagnosing the patient at the stage of pre-diabetes is very, very important in the sense that the complications which we see, the complications of diabetes are again divided into microvascular complications and the macrovascular complications. The microvascular complications being the diabetic retinopathy, the diabetic neuropathy, and the diabetic kidney disease. Earlier we used to call it diabetic nephropathy, and from 2016 onwards it is diabetic kidney disease. So these three are called the diabetic macrovascular complications. They are much dependent on the blood glucose levels. If you tightly control the blood glucose and you maintain a stringent HbA1c, the microvascular complications either will be delayed or will be like postponed. And whereas the macrovascular complications, when we come to this, they are the coronary artery disease and the stroke and the peripheral vascular disease, PVD or PAD, that is peripheral arterial disease. They are categorized as the macrovascular complications. And nowadays a single term is used instead of all these this thing except PVD. It is called atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, that is ASCVD, that comprises of both the heart problems as well as the brain problems, that is the coronary artery disease and the stroke. Put together it is called atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And this incidence is same when compared to the over diabetes and the pre-diabetes. That is the importance of pre-diabetes. If you can identify the pre-diabetes very early and you target that patient, you give him counseling with regards to the diet, exercise, the reduction in the weight, cessation of smoking, cessation of alcohol, along with metformin. If you can start metformin, you counsel the patient that you can either prevent the onset of type 2 diabetes, or you can delay the postpone the type 2 diabetes by 5 to 10 years if you strictly adhere to this 5 elements what I said, and along with that you can start a metformin. But metformin, as per the recommendations of the American Diabetes Association 2020 recommendations, it is being much underused. That is, out of 100 cases, only 3 patients are put on metformin in the pre-diabetic stage. And American Diabetes Association all the time stresses, not only the American Diabetes Association, the American College of Endocrinology, ACE, and the AAS, that is American Association of the Clinical Endocrinologists, they strongly say that metformin must be initiated in every case of the pre-diabetes, because they are more susceptible to the macrovascular complications, especially the cardiovascular complications are more in the pre-diabetes, like what we see in diabetes. So this is what all this slide says. So if you can target the patient at this particular level, you can prevent the onset of diabetes as well as the prevention of the complications also. And we'll move on to the next slide. And now coming to the good glycemic control, implications on short and long term basis. And now only 19% of the diabetic patients in India are good in good glycemic control. I still don't believe in this statement actually, because it's only 6 to 10% of the Indian diabetic patients are in good glycemic control. Per se, I'll tell you, the pathetic part and the tragic part of this particular scenario is with regards to diabetes, with regards to hypertension, with regards to dyslipidemia, that is even poorer also, the high cholesterol levels, and the only 50% of the people, they know that they have diabetes, they know that they have hypertension, they know that they are suffering from dyslipidemia. And another 50%, they are totally unaware of the fact that they have diabetes, they have hypertension, they have dyslipidemia. And out of the 50% who know that they have diabetes, 50% only go to the doctor, and out of that only 50% purchase the medicines, out of that only 50% will use the medicines, and only out of that 50% only will come to the doctor on regular basis, who are to the target. That finally comes to around some 6 to 10%, that's it, not more than 10% of the Indian population is to the target if it is related to diabetes mellitus, or it is related to the essential hypertension, or related to the dyslipidemia. That is not so in only the developing countries like India. the Asian subcontinent, even the most sophisticated countries like UK, USA, you find the same pathetic scenario. Little bit better when compared to the Indian scenario. They also, like US statistics say that 50% of the people, they don't know that they are suffering from hypertension. That is the pathetic part. And you can see this, the original article, the current status management, control complications and psychological aspects of the patients and the diabetes in India. This is from our the great teacher, Dr. Vishwanathan Mohan, a good friend of mine and also my good mentor actually. And this results from the DiabCare India 2011 study. This is a landmark study. And the mean glycosylated hemoglobin HbA1c 8.9%, that is plus or minus like 2.8%, that is almost 2% higher than, that is when you take this ADA recommendations, the cutoff of 7 as the target goal of A1C, 8.9 is somewhere around some 2% higher. It should be 7%. Actually, it is 8.9%. 2% higher than the American Diabetes recommended target. And coming to the poor glycemic control despite being under treatment, this is the pathetic part. And you can see 93.2% of the patients were on oral anti-diabetic drugs and 35.2% were on insulin. And now let's move on to this. The better HbA1c control reduces the long-term complications. That's what I've been stressing upon from the beginning. The lower the A1C, the lower the complications rate. And if you take this UKPDS, the gold standard study in the field of diabetes, which started in the year 1977, when probably I was doing my 6th or 7th standard, the United Kingdom prospective diabetes study started, and they evaluated after 10 years, that is 87, after 20 years, that is 97, after 30 years again 2007, after 40 years, that is 2017 also they evaluated. It's still going on. The UKPDS ongoing is still going on, and it says every 1% drop in the HbA1c is associated with the decreased risk of the following. Like you take the incidence of stroke, the every 1% drop in the HbA1c, suppose the A1c is 8% and you may get it to 7%, that's going to reduce the incidence of stroke by 12%, and the cataract extraction by 19%, and the incidence of heart failure, the risk reduction is by 16%, and the incidence of the relative risk reduction in the myocardial infarction by 14%, and the lower extremity amputation, that is called LLEA, that is called lower limb extremity amputation, which is defined as either the grade 2 amputation or the remaining 2 amputation or the half foot amputation or the total foot amputation or the above ankle amputation or the below knee amputation or the above knee amputation. These are all categorized as LLEA, that is called lower limb extremity amputations, or what I said, the fatal peripheral vascular disease or peripheral arterial disease. The relative risk reduction is by 43%, and the microvascular disease is the risk reduction is seen by 37% with just 1% drop in the A1C, and it's going to do a miracle, like the relative risk reduction in the all-cause mortality is by 14%, and a relative risk reduction RRR is the death related to diabetes by 21%. So I once again mind all my colleagues, please monitor HbA1c in your clinic on the day-to-day basis, that is at least once in 6 months as recommended by the American Diabetes Association, that is twice in a year. And I usually go by monitoring A1c once in 3 months, because once in 3 months if you can look at the HbA1c, we can assess the mean plasma glucose and how bad it is, and we can change either the lifestyle modifications or change the drugs, or we can switch over to the insulin, or the latest drugs have come, we can switch over to that and keep the patient in the safe zone. And coming to the last part of my talk, the timely insulin use, which is called the early initiation of insulin. This was the term, early initiation of insulin was coined by the Novo Nordisk people. That's a great term actually. It was coined long ago, like by more than 60 years ago, they just initiated this term, the early initiation of insulin, an Indian patient-centric approach. And coming to this slide, the timely insulin initiation is very logical and it's very intelligent act. Like whenever the patient is not getting to the target levels on multiple OADs, you don't need to waste your time by adding one more oral agent, which is not going to do anything miracle or something else. So it overcomes not only the glucotoxicity, it gives rest to the pancreas. See, whenever the blood sugars are elevated, that is, we have to take the things for granted that the pancreas is at stress and the beta cells, they need some rest. So if at all the pancreas is stressed out and the beta cells need some rest, what all we do is give rest to the pancreas. So the endogenous insulin, stop using the endogenous insulin and start the exogenous insulin, that is the insulin from the outside. What is shortfall in the body, that we are going to replace it in the form of insulin from the outside, that is called the exogenous insulin. Now if we see this, the bar diagrams and all, here you find the like four colors you find. The little bit dark blue is, that is continuous subcutaneous insulin infusion, that is CSII. In the remission group, they taken subjects were 68 in this study, and the MDI, that is light blue, and this second one, it is multiple daily injection doses. In the remission group, the number of subjects taken were 53, and you find the navy blue, the dark blue, navy blue, the oral hypoglycemic agents in the remission group. That was the subjects were taken, 27 patients were taken, and on the light, violet color, you find is the number of patients included were 204, and that is the non-remission group. And you take this, the y-axis and the x-axis, you see the line before the therapy, after the therapy, and after the 1 year therapy. If you can see the bar diagrams slowly declining, and finally you find that more than 50% of the participants remained in remission at the end of 1 year with insulin. And I mind you once again, the A1C reduction with insulin is the maximum A1C reduction. With no other drug, you find such a reduction in the drastic fall of HbA1c. Yet, this slide shows, yet the patients remain on multiple OAD therapy, that is oral antidiabetic therapy, too long. And you can see this, the graph actually. The distribution of HbA1c at the time of insulin initiation, usually on an average it is some 8.9%. See, the American Diabetes Association always says in its recommendations, if the HbA1c is around 9%, it's high time you have to start insulin. So the clinical inertia. So now we finished therapeutic inertia. Now we are coming to clinical inertia. So let's define what is clinical inertia. So clinical inertia is defined as the failure to establish appropriate targets and escalate the treatment to achieve the target treatment goals. And it accounts for a significant proportion of failure to achieve targets in the management of diabetes and contributes to up to 2 lakh adverse diabetes related outcomes per year. This is called clinical inertia. And again, clinical inertia may be of two types. That is clinician's inertia, where the healthcare professional is got some sort of inhibitions, is not aware of the recommendations and will not respond timely to the patient. And will not advise the patient to switch over to insulin. He cannot counsel the patient. This is called the clinician's inertia. And the second angle is the patient's inertia. The patient's inertia is even the doctor counsels the patient to switch over to insulin. The patient doesn't listen to that. The doctor says you have to go for exercise. He doesn't listen. He says weight reduction is mandatory, diet is mandatory, you have to stop alcohol, you have to stop smoking. Still the patient doesn't listen to the doctor. That is called patient's inertia. These are the two angles. And now at insulin initiation in this solved study, the average HbA1c was 8.9, as we can see in the bar diagram. The dotted one shows the HbA1c. Out of it, the 41% had somewhere around or more than 9% of HbA1c, and 22% had around that or more than 10% of HbA1c. And when you start the insulin, they naturally eventually like there is a fall in the HbA1c. And prior to the insulin initiation, patients had received oral anti-diabetic drugs therapy for a period of 8.7 plus or minus 6.7 years. And unlike insulin, addition of subsequent OAD doesn't offer benefit. That I have already discussed. See, when the patient is on 2 OADs and 3 OADs and 4 OADs, you still going on adding oral anti-diabetic drugs or oral hypoglycemic agents, OADs or OHAs. It doesn't give you any benefit to either the patient or the treating clinician. It's almost when you compare this, use of multiple OADs driven by convenience, acceptance by patients, and limited consultation time, the right approach in the early diabetes. And you find this. The navy blue is seen in the pre-treatment bar is navy blue, and the post-treatment is the grey color. You can definitely find a spurt, and the patient is on 2 OADs. You can see the graph coming down by 1% of HbA1c. On 3 OADs, it's around minus 0.5%, and on 4 OADs, it is only like the 0.2% of the increase in the HbA1c. And when you add insulin, it goes down, the HbA1c drastically goes down to minus 1.3. You can see here. And the use of multiple OAD is driven by the convenience, acceptance by patients, and limited consultant. Well, we have got certain constraints as clinicians in the busy practice. We have less time to give the patient the elaborate counseling which is required. So you should focus on the patient perspective, and you should give enough time for counseling and all. Or you can appoint one diabetes educator to educate them, one dietitian who gives the diet plans and all. And the substantial benefit from initiating insulin is the mean HbA1c decreases by 1.34%. That's what I said. The longer complication free survival. And this slide very clearly shows insulin is the treatment option which can provide the maximum HbA1c reduction. See, now from this, now we go from below upwards. Like first is the lifestyle modification. That's what I said. The diet, exercise, weight reduction, and cessation of smoking and cessation of alcohol. That leads to from 1 to almost 2 more than like around 2. That is 1% of HbA1c reduction is seen with lifestyle itself. And metformin, you can find another 1% reduction. With insulin, you can find the maximum, that is from 1.5 to 3.5, means that is around 2% of reduction is seen with insulin. And with sulfonylureas, you also find a good reduction. But anything when compared to this insulin is much lesser than that of the insulin. Like thiazolidinediones, you take the rosiglitazone, that is not available in our country, but very much available with a black box warning in the United States and other countries. Now we got only pioglitazone, and the GLP-1 receptor agonists, and the alpha glucosidase inhibitors, and the glinides, that is the meglitinide or the ripaglinide, and the neglitinide, and DPP-4 inhibitors, like starting from the vildagliptin to sitagliptin to saxagliptin to alogliptin to danagliptin to like linagliptin. And the SGLT2 inhibitors, we are currently we have 3 US FDA approved SGLT2 inhibitors in our country, the dapagliflozin and the empagliflozin and the canagliflozin. And one more Indian gliflozin is also available, that is remogliflozin from Glenmark. And in the abroad we find many more in the UCS, like in US the western scenario, you find the etugliflozin and the sotagliflozin and the bexagliflozin also in the pipeline, it is about to come. So you can see you can observe that the highest reduction of HbA1c is seen with insulin only when compared to the all other therapies. Let it be the oral agents or the newer agents, all the older agents. On this connection, I would like to say something about the Carbolina trial, because the Carolina trial with regards to sulfonylurea, because our practice in India goes by like lifestyle modification. After that we go for metformin. We had definitely a sulfonylurea, and then go for either a alpha glucosidase inhibitor or a low dose pioglitazone if it is not contraindicated. But all the time we had a suspicion, because every international session they just ridicule the sulfonylureas. They say out of market, about to vanish, something else they put after the slide. A tag will be there. But for the first time in the history, a sulfonylurea glimepiride was taken into study in the Carolina trial, where they have compared the efficacy of the glimepiride with that of the linagliptin. That is, Carolina is nothing but the cardiovascular outcome trial of linagliptin. This is the only one active comparative CV trial, that is cardiovascular trial. And the results were so surprising, though there was little bit of the incidence of hypoglycemia in the glimepiride arm, but the weight gain also was little bit more in the glimepiride arm. But it was only for the first 1-2 years. This trial went on for more or less 6 years. And after the second year, we never have seen the weight gain with this particular glimepiride, and we have not seen any cardiovascular adverse events with the glimepiride for a period of 6 years, because this is the particular the glimepiride molecule doesn't impair the ischemic precondition, that is called IPC, thereby doesn't interfere with the cardiovascular dysfunction. So you will not find so far in the 6 years of study, like linagliptin, the glimepiride did not show any adverse cardiovascular events, and linagliptin was shown to be non-inferior to our glimepiride. So this is, we all must be like proud of our sulfonylurea, like we use it day and out in our clinical practice, and the cheapest one and the best one used with caution, that's going to reduce the A1C, that's going to preserve the beta cell function, and it's either weight neutral, a little bit of weight gain may be there. But when compared to the other sulfonylureas like the glibenclamide or the glipizide or the glyclazide, even the glyclazide is supposed to be the safest of sulfonylureas along with glimepiride. So I just wanted to touch upon that, and I just forgot to mention, every time we start the session on insulin, we should remember the great discoverer of the insulin, that is none other than our Grant Frederick Banting, who was an orthopedic surgeon in Toronto University in Canada, who discovered insulin in 1920 along with Charles Best and J.J.R. MacLeod, and James Collip was the one who has prepared the purified form of insulin from the crude insulin, which was discovered by Grant Frederick Banting. And for that, Grant Frederick Banting was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1923. At a very young age, he is the only one doctor on the earth so far who has received the Nobel Prize at the age of 23, winning a Nobel Prize at the age of 23 in the field of medicine and physiology. This is a record forever. Nobody has broken that record so far. So we must always be thankful to Grant Frederick Banting for not having claimed the royalty over insulin. That is the reason why we are getting this the human genetically engineered rDNA human insulins at a very affordable price of 1 rupees 50 paisa. 150 rupees each vial. Either it is biphasic premixed or even short acting insulin or the NPH, that is neutral hazed on protamine, that is you get it for 150 rupees, because the reason is he has never wanted any royalty from this particular his discovery on insulin. On the role of insulin in the current COVID-19 pandemic situation, you always as a clinician, you know that insulin is the drug of choice in any acute infections. Let it be a viral infection, let it be a bacterial infection, let it be whatever be the critical illness, insulin is the only option in the inpatient setting or in the ICU setting or in the critically ill patient settings. And the basic requirement for the SARS-CoV-2, that is the causative organism for this particular the virus is called SARS-CoV-2, that is severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, that is named because SARS was also caused by this coronavirus, that's SARS-CoV, where it happened in the late 2002 to 2003. So, and again it is the cause for MERS, which happened in the year 2012, the end of 2012 to 2013 it happened. The agent was same agent, that was SARS-CoV was the agent for SARS and the MERS, and now it is called a novel coronavirus, that is called severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. It requires a low pH to enter into the cells via the angiotensin converting enzyme 2, ACE2 receptors. It acts by sticking itself to the ACE2 receptors. That requires a low pH for that virus to enter into the body, and whereas insulin stimulates the sodium hydrogen exchange, and which increases the pH, so that it reduces the possibility of the virus adhering to the ACE2 receptors and thereby prevents the cell infection by the coronavirus. On the role of insulin in the current COVID-19 pandemic situation, like it's a very busy slide, you cannot, it's not visible also. The uninfected type 2 diabetes mellitus patients should intensify the metabolic control as means of primary prevention of COVID-19 disease, and insulin is a safe choice under most circumstances and can be a superior alternate in treating the type 2 diabetes mellitus patients with poor glycemic control. And I wanted to add one more thing here, and along with insulin, all the time you add metformin. Don't discontinue metformin in the even COVID pandemic, whether the patient is in the mild stage or moderate stage or in the inpatient setting also. Don't stop metformin unless otherwise he is put on ventilators. Don't discard metformin, because metformin is very much implicated in the reduction of the viral replication in this COVID-19 pandemic. So metformin has got a tremendous role. In some other countries they are using metformin even in the COVID-19 pandemic in the non-diabetic segments also. And diabetes is a predictor of mortality in COVID-19 pandemic, and you can see this the mortality rates, and the A1C is the adjusted hazard ratio of mortality, keeping HbA1c around 6.5 to 7. That's what I've been as the comparator, and all the time you try to maintain the HbA1c around or below 7. If it is in between 6.5 and 7, it is excellent. And you can see the T1DM and the T2DM mortality and the hazard ratio. You can see if the A1C is around 6.5 to 7%, the mortality rate is almost nil. and if it is 7.5 to 9%, the mortality rate, the hazard ratio is 1.15 in type 1 diabetes mellitus, whereas it is 1.23 in type 2 diabetes mellitus. And if it is the A1C is 9 to 10, the T1DM mortality hazard ratio is 1.31, and the T2DM mortality is 1.37. And if it is more than 10, in T1DM the mortality goes up to 2.19, and whereas the T2DM mortality goes up to 1.62. In people with diabetes, improving glycemic control and optimizing the body weight reduces the adverse outcomes of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And uncontrolled diabetes affects the outcomes of acute infectious diseases and increase the hospitalizations and mortality. And in this connection, I would like to stress upon again and again, there are certain risk factors for this, the COVID-19 infection. The first risk factor will be the age. As the age increases, like 50 you have some amount of risk, and after 60 the risk is much increased, after 70 it is much more increased, and as the age increases, the risk increases, and the morbidity and the mortality also they go parallel with the age. And hypertension is one, and the risk factor, and the diabetes mellitus, let it be T1DM or T2DM, whatever it may be, is one the big risk factor. And the cardiovascular disease of any sort, let it be coronary artery disease or the MI or the heart failure and acute coronary syndromes, they are the biggest risk factors. And patients with chronic liver disease CLD and patients with CKD, that is chronic kidney disease, or CRF, chronic renal failure, and the patients suffering from the malignancy, that is either on the chemotherapy or on the radiotherapy, are the patients whom we put on the corticosteroids for autoimmune diseases, where like rheumatoid arthritis or the ankylosing spondylitis or the systemic lupus erythematosus, where we only as clinicians we start the steroid therapy for them. They are all immunocompromised patients. They are categorized under the category of immunocompromised patients. These are the patients who are at high risk of getting the COVID-19 infection. So you need to remember and follow accordingly, keeping all this in back of mind. And in mild to moderate infections of COVID, you don't need to change the disease as far as the patient is taking either home quarantine or home isolation. You don't need to change the treatment. If it is the severe form, you have to either the inpatient setting, let it be inpatient setting or ICU setting, or the critically ill patients who are on oxygen or the ventilation. The add-on must be, you have to take off all the oral anti-diabetic drugs. You have to keep the patient on only insulin. Again, it depends whether the patient is in DKA or not in DKA. Then, if it is in DKA, you need to counter it by the regular insulin and the correction of hydration by adequate hydration by NS, and again adequate balancing the electrolytes. The electrolyte imbalance must be targeted. If the patient is not in DKA, you can go for a basal bolus insulin, perfect control with the insulins, and along with that and metformin either to be used or not to be used will be the decision will be taken by either the intensivist or the endocrinologist or the physician who is taking care of that particular patient. And this is an old slide. All the time we see that Indian diet, it is very high in carbohydrates. Almost if you take this graph, you can see that three groups. The lower one is the protein group, and the middle one is the carbohydrate group, and the upper light blue is the fat content. And it is in the rural setting, in the urban setting of India, and the last is the western scenario. You compare that, okay, almost all parts of India, they consume somewhere around some 71% to 76% of carbohydrates, and 11% of the proteins, and the 13% in the rural setting of proteins, and 18% of proteins in the urban setting. Whereas in the abroad, they take 39% of carbs. That is the reason why the carbohydrates are the biggest culprits in the disease progression or in the complications or as a causative factor for type 2 diabetes itself is the consumption of high quantity of carbohydrates. See the Western scenario, they are taking only 39% of carbs, they are taking 17% of proteins and 43% of the fats. Then India, the cereals continue to be the main staple, and for us rice is the staple diet for the South Indian parts, and wheat is the staple for the North Indian parts, and provide the bulk of the calories. High calorie intakes are largely due to high intakes of, this is important, refined cereals are very bad and refined carbohydrates are very bad. Even the refined proteins are also very bad. Even the refined fats are also very bad. Anything that is refined, let it be cereals or carbohydrates or proteins or fats, is bad. Never take refined oils, never take refined proteins, never take refined carbohydrates, never take refined cereals. You take either whole wheat, that is best. You take unpolished, that is brown rice. You take the basmati rice, because you need to be cautious and conscious about the glycemic load and the glycemic index at the same time, because our rice what we take, the Kurnool Sona, falls under the category of high GI, that is again glycemic index is divided into mild, moderate, severe. Anything of GI below 55 is categorized as mild glycemic index food, and anything in between 55 to 70 is categorized as moderate glycemic index foods, and anything above 70 GI foods, they are called the severe GI foods. So whereas the rice falls under the category of above 70, that is what we take the regular rice, the Kurnool Sona or Sona Masuri is more than 70, so it should not be taken. And the potatoes also, and you can replace the potatoes with sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes, they fall under the category of low GI, and the yams. And in place of white rice, you can go for either the brown rice or the parboiled rice or the basmati long grain rice, which they fall under the category of low GI foods. So you can replace the food with that, and you can balance the food. You can reduce the quantity of carbohydrates. So preferably what I feel is the balanced nutritious diet of an Indian should be like 40% must be carbohydrates and 30% must be proteins, 30% must be fats. That is the ideal diet wherein you can stop. And out of all the diets, we have so many diets. We have like a Mediterranean diet, we have the paleo diet, we have the non-vegetarian diet and vegetarian diet and vegan diet, and several diet we have. And the best on the earth is supposed to be the Mediterranean diet, is supposed to be the best. That is going to the least cause for type 2 diabetes or the metabolic syndrome or the pre-diabetes or the incidence of heart attacks or the complications of all the metabolic parameters or metabolic diseases or disorders. High carbohydrate diets, they raise the plasma glucose, insulin, triglycerides and non-esterified fatty acids, leading to insulin resistance. And Indian healthcare scenario. See, the WHO all the time says, according to the norms, the doctor-patient population must be like for every 1,000 population, there must be one qualified doctor. Now, I am not talking about the quacks and all. I am talking about the qualified doctors. That is, we are the RMPs, we are the registered medical practitioners. They have hijacked our RMPs and they started calling themselves as RMPs. That is, rural medical practitioners. We are the registered medical practitioners. And according to WHO, it is 1:1,000. And now we see this. You see the graphs, the number. The Germany is on the top with the highest doctor population. Per 1,000 population, it has got 4.125 doctors. As Australia, we can see 3.374 doctors, and Russia 3.306, and France 3.227, and USA has got 2.554 doctors, and Brazil has 1.852, and China has 1.49. And now coming to the Indian countries. Now see the red line India, it has got 0.62 doctors per 1,000 population. So much less than the WHO specifications and norms. And Bangladesh 0.389 and Afghanistan 0.304, and the government doctors in India very pathetic, it is 0.09 per 1,000 population. So the mean duration of consultation time in India is almost 1.5 to 2.3 minutes. Overstressed and overburdened. All the doctors are overstressed and overburdened with the patient, so that they are not able to contribute enough time for the patient. On an average, the patient gets only 1.5 minutes to 2.5 minutes time in the doctor's chamber. That is very pathetic actually. And premix insulins suit the Indian reality and can address the high carb diet in a convenient diet. First of all, you must reduce the carbohydrate load, and then you make it 40, 30, 30, good. 40 carbs and 30 protein and 30 fats, that is best. And in any setting, the biphasic premixed human insulins, that's what you see the 30-70. What is the premix human insulin, that is regular human insulin, and the NPH, that is neutral protamine Hayes-Dan. See, it is 30-70, some we get 50-50 also. The same when it comes to this is the genetically engineered rDNA insulins, that is. And coming to the analog insulins, the biphasic analogs, that is the plain aspart and the protaminated aspart. You see that this is 30-70, and coming to the best combination on the earth, the insulin degludec and aspart, where you find the aspart, the 30%, and the ultra long acting basal analog, the degludec, the remaining 70%, which is called primarily a basal plus regime, which can be started once a day and can be switched over to twice a day, which gives you the 100% control and brings back to the normalcy of A1C of around 6.5 to 7. That is the best quality we see with this classical aspart and IDAC-ASP we call, that's what. And now it's time to take some take home message. Early initiation of insulin, that's what I have told in the beginning. Early insulin initiation is physiologically very intelligent, and timely insulin positively alters the course of disease progression. Absolutely yes. And improving the glycemic control reduces the risk of long-term complications. Absolutely yes. And to summarize the things, and this is the core take-home messages. Number one take-home message is early insulin indication is the physiologically intelligent and positively alters the course of disease progression. And the second take-home message is a larger proportion of patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus, they require better early and long-term glycemic control, and there are ways to overcome treatment barriers. And the last take-home message is the newer insulin analogs are safe and they are more convenient compared to the human insulins and can break the barriers to timely insulin initiation. And thank you very much for your patient listening. Thanks all.